Looks like we're live. Welcome, everyone. This is Gunita from the 1947 Partition Archive. Today, it's my pleasure to host Khan Husaan Zia, and it's day 22 of our series, 75 Days of Partition. Today, we're going to learn about some fascinating history of the Pathans of Jalandhar and Ludhiana. So let me just give you a little bit of a bio of Mr. Zia quickly, and then we will dive right into this absolutely fascinating history and some of the conversations he's had with some of the later history makers, such as Radcliffe's secretary. So Mr. Zia was born in Basti Danishmadan, which is west of Jalandhar city, in a very, very old settlement from the 1600s. He was born in 1933. In 1947, he had to migrate to Sialkot under very terrible conditions at the time, and he witnessed a lot of horrors and continued to suffer from PTSD due to that. In 1951, he joined the Pakistani military, and he served in a number of positions and retired in 1977, and also served in the position of Deputy Chief of the Naval Staff. He migrated to Canada in 1992 and started to work on his family history, and that's some of what he's going to talk about today. He met some really interesting people in this journey when he was documenting his family history, including Christopher Beaumont, who was the secretary to Sir Cyril Radcliffe, who drew, as you know, the Radcliffe Line, who was in charge of the Boundary Commission. So welcome to this episode, Mr. Zia. How are you doing today?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me, actually, to talk about these things.
Yeah, thank you. It's incredible for us to learn. So I think, we're all so curious. We want to dive into, since this is a shorter podcast, I want to dive right into this incredible history of how the Pathans came and settled in Ludhiana and Punjab, basically what we now consider East Punjab. So we'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
This was all about actually trading. Trading went on for considerable centuries before that. And Pathans were basically tradesmen those days. They brought mostly horses to India. For some reason, it's difficult to breed horses, so they were brought from Central Asia to India and sold there. And then they would take some manufactured goods back to Central Asia and sell them. So this was the beginning of it. And there was a small outpost in Jalandhar city where Pathans had lived. It was called Mahalla Karar Khan. I think it might still be there. And then eventually something happened where my family had lived in South Waziristan. We don't know quite what, either it was differences between people or for whatever reason, some 40 families in a caravan came and bought land outside Jalandhar, and they established a settlement. First one was Basti Danishmanda, then the second one was Basti Sheikh Darwesh, and then other Bastis got settled one after the other as the population.
Approximately? What time period was this approximately?
This was the first building was built there in 1609.
Amazing.
Yeah, AD by a gentleman called Mia Sheikh Darwesh. His mausoleum is still in Basti Sheikh Darwesh. It is there. It has significance for the Sikhs in particular because the Pathans had sheltered Guru Gobind Singh, the 10th Guru, Sikh Guru, there for some time, given him protection, from people who were chasing around.
Wow, that's absolutely fascinating. And so there were 12 bastis in total, if I recall.
Yeah, 12 bastis, but then during the period of the Sikh rule, there were lots of strife and dislocation, and so the Pathans tried to defend themselves as best as they could against raids by Sikhs. And 3 of the bastis, outlying bastis, got burnt and were destroyed. And the rest 9 survived until 1947. They were still there.
Wow. And what areas were these in exactly in Ludhiana and Jalandhar?
No, in Ludhiana, the Pathans were different.
Okay.
In Jalandhar, this was just west of the Jalandhar city, and some of the land was, but it extended for about 4 miles and about maybe 3.5 miles wide, something like between 10 and 15 square miles were these bastis located to the west and southwest of Jalandhar city.
Wow, that's incredible. And so, how did you have a decision to migrate in 1947? What happened, and what caused your family?
What had happened was that there was, you see, the partition wasn't. We weren't quite sure whether Jalandhar would be in Pakistan or India, because Jalandhar was a Muslim majority district, and so was Gurdaspur. For some reason, the person who drew the line between India and Pakistan through Punjab decided to give Gurdaspur to India. Basically, the speculation is that it was to give India access to Kashmir, otherwise Kashmir was cut off from India. So when he decided to give Gurdaspur to India, then Jalandhar got cut off. It had no connection, land connection with Pakistan. So he threw in Jalandhar as well to India. But and there was at that time still speculation until the Radcliffe Award was announced 3 days after independence. And at that time, we came to know that it's going to be in India. And there was a lot of disturbances, riots, and killings. And Jalandhar city, half of it was burning at that time, and a terrible time. And at that time, my father was a judge, and he was on leave in Jalandhar, and we were all living in Jalandhar. And then Sardar Patel, who was the interior minister, he came to Jalandhar because Jalandhar had been made the capital of East Punjab. First capital of East Punjab was in Jalandhar. He came there, and a delegation of Muslims went to see him. And he told them point blank that you got to leave. You can't live here because we expect some Hindus and Sikhs to come from Pakistan, and they have to be settled somewhere. So you got to pack up and leave.
Wow.
That was the first part. But then I think about a week later, Nehru came also. And so the delegation again went. My father was, I think, one of them. The delegation, and they tried to plead with Nehru. And according to my father, what he said was that he gave us a long lecture about the history of India, about history of Punjab, and what a great place it was, and so on. And every time we mentioned that we've become citizens of India and we are entitled to some protections or something like that, he would keep quiet, go into a stance or something. And that's where the matter rested. And then eventually, one day, the boundary force, which was providing some kind of protection, they were wound up. And they came and told us that we can't guarantee any more safety for you. You have to leave. So all of us, not my family in particular, but all of the rest of the population of Muslims were herded to Jalandhar cantonment. And there was a refugee camp set up there, so they moved there. And from there, they, in parts, they moved to Pakistan, mostly by road, on foot, on ox carts and things like that. Terrible things happened. But I don't want to go into it because it disturbs me actually.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. And you were how old at the time? You were around 14 or
I was about little short of 14 at that time.
Yeah.
And one of the things that sticks to my mind is, it never leaves you, these kind of memories, that a lot of Muslims had come from the city whose houses had been looted and burnt, and there had been killings. So they came and took shelter in our basti also, in other bastis as well, but in our basti there were about 4,000 people. That was about 10 times the population of the basti itself. And they were living there, and you could see that Jalandhar city was burning, because those days it was summer and we slept on the roof in charpais, and you could see that the city was burning, and these poor refugees were camped. And sometime during the night, one of them would have a nightmare and he would start screaming, "Aa gaye, aa gaye, they are coming, they are coming." And everyone would wake up. And my father would take me to the roof, and he had two guns. And he gave me a shotgun. He had a hunting rifle. So he would take that, and I would cover one side of the house, he would cover the other side. And the thing that sticks me in my mind is that every evening he would remind me. He said, if I get killed first, don't finish off all the cartridges. Keep one each for your mother and sisters.
Oh my
Make sure they are killed, or you kill them before they kill you. This is the kind of environment that prevailed, the things we had to endure at that time. And as a 14-year-old, it leaves I had terrible nightmares, but I couldn't possibly kill my mother and sisters. But that was his instruction, and I'm sure he would have done it.
Wow, that's incredible. That's incredible.
So
And
this is the kind of tragedy that it was. I don't want to talk about it. It's too much, actually.
yeah, for sure. Well, thank you for telling us even this little bit.
Yeah.
It's difficult, but I think it's important for us to know what happened. And I wanted to ask you about culture. So for the who had settled in these bastis, what was the difference in culture compared to the sort of greater culture of Punjab around you?
No, it was nothing to do with Punjab culture. These people had preserved their original cultural mores and traditions exactly intact as they had been in South Waziristan. And they still, at the songs they sang on weddings, for instance, were in a language we didn't understand. But the women, and they used to have a particular dance. It was called Banksi, a very graceful little dance they would do. And the songs were in a language which wasn't even Pashto or Urmudi, which was the common languages in that area. I think it originated from Central Asia, from where they had first come. and they had still maintained them. And the embroidery, which they mostly used for children's clothing, they used to have these kurtas made for children. It was very unique in the sense that it existed nowhere in India, and particularly the style of embroidery. And it wasn't until I came to Canada and I was learning French, and I had a lady from Hungary, and she talked about Hungary, and one day she showed me a book, and in that it was exactly the same embroidery.
Wow.
So I made photocopies of it and I kept it, and I said, how come do you have these? He said, these are our traditional things and they have come from. Subsequently, it occurred to me that what had happened was that when our people moved from Central Asia, some people had gone to Europe also from Central Asia, and they had settled in what is now Austria and Hungary and some other places. And they had preserved this culture just like we had done in Bastis. In Jalandhar, they had still that same style of embroidery and same style of stitching in Hungary also. So in a way, it tells you that we are all united one way or the other, and we all have common origins somewhere.
Absolutely. And are there people who still sing this language?
Yeah, they do, and they sing the same songs. But I have even I asked people in Lahore, where we have now settled, to make videos of the Banksi. My sisters do it. I mean, at weddings they still do it, and the stitching is still done in Lahore. I have got sort of samples of it here.
That's
My grandchildren wear it actually sometimes.
Wow, that is so fascinating. I hope more to preserve culture, and then I hope some anthropologists will come and study connection to the cultures that are in Hungary. That's just so fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. I wanted to jump right into now your meeting with Christopher Beaumont and some of the things that you learned about.
What had happened was, you see, that when Radcliffe made that award, he had included, according to Beaumont, he had come prepared that Gurdaspur in any case was going to India, whether it was Muslim majority or not. So he said that was never open to question. But what had happened was that Zira and Firozpur tehsils from Firozpur district had also been included by Radcliffe in the original award. And these had been given to Pakistan. And subsequently, at some stage, these were changed and they were given to India after the award had been made, and they were changed. So this Christopher Beaumont, who was secretary to Radcliffe, he had pangs of conscience that this was something, this gerrymandering had been done after the award had been given, and there was a dishonesty involved and so on. So he wrote a deposition that explaining how this was done, and it was done under pressure from Mountbatten, and he deposited this deposition with the warden of All Souls College in Oxford, where he had studied, and with the proviso that it should only be opened after his death and only with the permission of the All Souls College, the warden of the All Souls College, and the foreign secretary, or what they call the principal undersecretary of foreign affairs in England. And when I came to know about it, I got in touch with him, and we became sort of friends. I used to go and see him once or twice a year, and he would write letters to me, and we exchange views back and forth. And I tried to persuade him that if you die and this deposition, I ask for this deposition, nobody is going to give it to me. Why should they? It's a British secret, and they will naturally be duty bound to preserve it. So the only thing is that if you want to be the truth to be known, you should give it in your lifetime. And after a long time of thinking, he eventually sent it to me in a parcel in Canada, actually, in all the places. And he sent it to me. This is how it started, and this is where he has recorded this, that this gerrymandering was done, this switch was made, and that Mountbatten was responsible for putting pressure on Radcliffe to change the award after it had been made.
What was the reason for that, you think?
Oh, I think the reason for it was that there was actually it's recorded now, the state of Bikaner, the canals flowing to Bikaner went through Zira, or I think Firozpur as well. And he was worried that if these canals are, coming to Bikaner through Pakistan, then he may have some difficulty or whatever the thing was. So he had a chief minister, what they call Diwan, a famous man called Sardar Panikar. He sent him to Mountbatten to say that, if you give these two tehsils to Pakistan, then he will have to consider acceding to Pakistan rather than to India. And this was the crux of the matter. And this is what presumably persuaded Mountbatten to intercede for changing the award after Radcliffe had finalized it.
Fascinating. About the water.
Yeah.
It's about water and resources.
But there's another gentleman actually who was very close to Mountbatten, a fellow who had risen from a clerk all the way to a secretary of the central government. He was a very favorite of Mountbatten also. He's a constitutional advisor called V.P. Menon. He's written a book called Transfer of Power, I think, in India. In that he also mentions it, something about this. And other people have also written about this.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what else did you come across in your research that you would like to share with us?
Oh, there are many things, actually. To start with, it's often said that partition was a brainchild of Jinnah. Actually, historically, this is wrong. Jinnah was very much a person who was for Hindu Muslim unity, and he started life like that, became famous for it. In fact, he arranged what was known as the Lucknow Pact in 1916, which brought an arrangement between Hindus and Muslims. And after that, he used to be called the ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity. Actually, he was dubbed like that. So he wasn't a communalist or anything like that as such. He was not the proponent of partition. The man who first officially proposed the idea was a Hindu leader from Punjab. His name was Lala Lajpat Rai. He set up the, I think, oh, Aryan movement. I think Arya Samaj.
Arya Samaj.
He was started that. Anyhow, sorry.
I think you were telling us.
Sorry, partition. The thing he proposed it. You see, Mr. Gandhi had set up in 1927 a committee consisted of Mr. Nehru, Jawaharlal Nehru, and his father. Two persons is set up a committee to propose a constitution for India. And they had interviewed various people, including Lala Lajpat Rai. And that's where Lala Lajpat Rai had proposed that India should be partitioned and Muslim areas should be cut off, and we can get on with pure Aryan, what he called Aryan India. Mr. Gandhi wasn't in favor of it, so the idea died out. But that was 3 years before the first Muslim talked about it. That was the poet-philosopher Iqbal in at the conference, Muslim League session in Allahabad in 1930. So 3 years before, a Hindu had proposed it, actually. This is how it started. It is often said that, the idea started was in 1940 when the Muslim League had its session in Lahore. This is not true. Muslim League session, the resolution passed by the Muslim League in 1940 in Lahore, if you read it, it doesn't mention Pakistan anywhere. It doesn't mention partition anywhere. It just talks about groupings of provinces where where Muslims were in majority. And but very much so that they would be a part of India with that idea. And in passing, they had only mentioned that in case Congress doesn't agree to this grouping of Muslim provinces, then partition should be examined or proposed as an alternative, meaning that groupings were a basic requirement. And the groupings were basically that what Jinnah called the tyranny of the majority, that Muslims would always be in minority, their interests would always be subservient to Hindu interests. So he wanted some guarantees for Muslims within India, and which didn't happen because I think the Nehru and co, they were, particularly Mr. Patel, they were much more for a unitary form of government with power centered in one place and not with regions or dissipated in some way. That was the origin of it. The other thing was, we've already talked about that how the partition map was prepared or how the partition was carried out. It is very easy to prove it if you go into details, particularly how Shakargarh Tehsil of Pakistan was cut off and the boundary line was shifted from Ravi River just going northwards, so that that chunk of Gurdaspur, which was adjacent to Kashmir went to India. Anyhow, that's something.
And
The third thing which I wanted to bring out was that, you see, Muslims and Hindus had lived for over 1,000 years. They had lived in separate communities, they had separate cultures, they had separate sort of communities, but they had lived peacefully for over 1,000 years. There was no instance of large scale looting, burning, killings that went on in 1947. These were so often, particularly in the West, it was said that it was a religious conflict, what happened in 1947. And I, who saw it at that time, and my father was a civil servant, he was a judge involved in these things. He had Hindu friends, we had Hindu friends, and we didn't intermingle in the sense socially, we didn't intermarry, but the friendships were there. We was, common people, common interests. And why suddenly everything blows up? It is my observation that it was only because the British were in too much of a hurry to leave India. And unfortunately, Congress was also in a great hurry because they didn't trust the British. They said if we let them settle down, then they will go back on their promise to leave India. So the two combined to hurry the departure of Britain from India. If it had been done in an organized way, if the dominions had been set up and allowed to become established, then none of this would have happened, or at least very little of it would have happened, actually. This is my considered opinion that it was avoidable.
yeah.
And you see, the thing is, for instance, I know about Jalandhar. In Jalandhar, first of all, what they did was they um, transferred all the Muslim and the British officers out of the district. They were let go. And Hindus and Sikhs came and took over the place. Secondly, and more importantly, the police, particularly the lower level of police, constables and sub-inspectors and things like that, these were mostly Muslims. Some 80% of them were Muslims in Jalandhar. They were disarmed immediately and sent home. They were discharged from service. And with the result that there was no law enforcement or effective law enforcement agency left.
Interesting.
What happened was that people formed groups and they said, oh, this Muslim village, you see, they've got so many buffaloes and so many oxen and so on, and we can go and attack it and loot it. They would make a scheme and go and burn the place down, kill a few people. Others would run away and loot the place and come back. I remember that some Sikhs would go, they would leave the bastis and go from sideways to do this filthy work in the city, because city had a lot of wealth and opportunities. And then they would loot some liquor shops and they would get drunk. And then they would forget that they got to bypass the bastis. So they would come through the bastis drunk, and people would beat them up. They would lose whatever they had. And so that's how I know that this thing,
Lawlessness.
this went on. So it was only because there was no police.
Right. Right.
Nobody. Then the other thing was that there was a semblance of order maintained by um, the Punjab Boundary Force, which was an army thing of about 25 battalions of army were allocated to assist the civil administration for some peculiar wisdom. The Indian government decided to disband it, and this was disbanded on 1st of September, I think. So they were only there for 1 month, where there was relative peace. But after that, the floodgates opened when the Punjab Boundary Force was disbanded. There was nothing left, so anyone could do anything. Occasionally, there were people from Patiala Army, from Nabha, from state, from Kapurthala state. The soldiers would join them, and they would find sometimes 1,000 strong, raiding villages, and all sorts of crimes were committed: murder, rape,
And it was for personal.
burning. It just went on completely free. The last convoy that came of refugees came to Lahore from Rohtak and Hisar area. They were Meo tribesmen who were Muslims. They came, and that was in December. So for 4 months, there was absolute mayhem. There was nothing. All of East Punjab was burning. And this went on, which was a great tragedy. It was totally unnecessarily, totally unavoidable. And I think Britain has to take responsibility for it.
Absolutely.
And they take this view that, oh, no, it was the Muslims versus Hindus. It was breakdown of law and order.
Absolutely. That's what I gathered from
Yeah.
stories as well. That's so it's so great to hear that from somebody who was there.
Yeah.
Articulate.
Yeah. But it is a terrible time. I don't want to talk about it, actually. It was horrible. The things you saw, oh God. It was awful, awful.
I hope that we're able to get some sort of apology or reparations, from the British at some point. For this.
Britain has now become a very reduced power. In fact, it's not a power at all. It's a satellite of United States.
Island in the North Atlantic now.
Where in lots of London? North of London. Oh, sorry.
No, I was just saying it's a small island in the North Atlantic.
Oh, yeah.
So, but anyway, it was really great to have you on today. I think we've gone a little over time, but that was, I think, so fascinating and so important and interesting for our audience to hear. So I thank you very much for coming on. Please stay on. We're going to go ahead and end the show, and I will